Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Boardwalk Tech webinar, Digital Transformation Combining Blockchain Technology and Machine Learning in Supply Chain Today. My name is JB Kupi. I'm the Senior Vice President for Marketing here at Boardwalk Tech. Appreciate everybody signing up for the webinar today. And what I was going to do is walk everyone through basically a presentation that talks about the blockchain market today and the offering that we have in it. And I would encourage you during the course of the presentation, if there are any questions that you have, to go ahead and use the little panel on the side with GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar to submit questions. And I will try and answer all of them during the course of the presentation today. But if not, we will certainly follow up with you afterwards. With that, we'll get going. Let me start a little bit just quickly to give you a background about Boardwalk Tech, because that's always kind of a nice thing to start with so you know where we're coming from. We're actually not new to the market. You may hear from a lot of companies talking about blockchain that have just formed in the last year or two, because really the genesis of blockchain as it relates to enterprise has kind of happened over the last couple of years. But we invented a digital ledger technology that's been used to support the collaborative exchange of information between companies for the last 13 years. And we, in fact, have a patent on this technology, which is a patented blockchain ledger, or a digital blockchain ledger, that is really kind of the core of what's needed for enterprise applications, and we'll kind of get into that. But this gives you a little overview of the different customers that have been using our technology for this time in many different areas of the supply chain for apparel and food and beverage and pharmaceutical. And also with consulting companies and other ones that we've been working with over time. And if you think about blockchain itself and actually the companies and what the focus is for most companies, we think that really blockchain is part of the digital transformation process. And most companies are looking at the way they interact with who they work with. And they say, you know, historically, there's been a strategy effort on behalf of the company with some level of, you know, market research, and then basically historical information or POS data that says, you know, what's happened, and they kind of come up with a plan and say, this is how we're going to try and execute against the business. But as you look at going forward and you want to embrace this notion of a digital enterprise, then collaboration is really a hugely important part of the communication, both with your customers and with your trading partners, because it's only through collaboration that you're able to really get a feel for what's happening in the market, and getting that information in a time frame so that you can still act against it in order to make decisions that affect your business. And what we focus on is the data side of this, and also since we focus on the data side, we're able to leverage the machine learning capabilities of looking at the interactions that happen between people and using that as a basis for providing some inferencing about what is going to happen from an analytics perspective and a machine learning perspective. But the issue that I think most people are facing is that, you know, change is difficult. There's a lot of systems and technology that have been around for a long time that really are not designed to work with blockchain, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then really this notion of, you know, all the data being disconnected and not having a very good way to share it is a real kind of impediment to this. And this is what, you know, we try and focus on specifically. So let's kind of establish the base for the technology, because this is really where we focus, is being built from the ground up on what's called transaction chaining technology. And let me just kind of move you from left to right here, because I think most of you are aware of Bitcoin, because that's where the first commercial app, well, not really commercial, but the first widely deployed application of blockchain came about. And really, in the case of Bitcoin, it's a chain of digital signatures, right? So in a blockchain application, you are exchanging a coin between a couple different people, and then I'm selling this many for this amount, and then there has to be a reconciliation to the ledger to say there's only 21 million coins out there, and what's the totality of, you know, the Bitcoin universe. So it's a fairly simplistic process, And then the blockchain is the irrefutable transaction store for the result of these interactions. Now, if you move into the enterprise is very different. And this is just a little snippet of data to say, well, here's an exchange that you may have in supply chain where you've got different SKUs and you're talking with different mills and you've got quantities and lead times and ship dates. And if you think about the transactions you have with your trading partners, it's a lot more than I've sold you a coin for $5 on November 15th. There's all sorts of data that needs to be able to be managed in the enterprise. And if you look at other systems, they almost invariably work with the data either what's called a record object level, which is something you'd see inside of a traditional enterprise application, the SAP, the Oracle, any database area, or they dump it into a file. And the problem with that is that there's really no concept of time against any of this data. So if you look at a traditional data environment and you say, hey, there's that number 200, unless you go in and do journaling, there's really no timestamps against that individual record. And if you don't have timestamps and you don't understand the time and how it's changed, and then more specifically, if this value goes from 200 to 300, you need to be able to act against that in the concept of a smart contract. All of this with other application approaches is custom work. They have to go in and they have to write all of this code in order to support the smart contracts and the journaling of the data. And it becomes very difficult to stand this up, which is why you see so many POCs that are taking a long time and cost a lot of money, and then they end up basically being a custom application, which is really not the long-term goal of blockchain in the enterprise. And so what we bring is actually a patented technology, which is very interesting in that if you think about enterprise data, you go into your Oracle, or you go into Salesforce or anything, and you run a query and say, give me a dump of my information. It's a set of rows and columns of data. And what we're able to do is we work with grids of data, which is effectively this blockchain ledger, but we manage data at an individual attribute level. So we take information and we're able to have multiple people interact and multiple systems interact with data at this level, and then chain these transactions together with transaction IDs and also versioning. So we're able to know that, hey, the value is currently 28,500, but it used to be this and it used to be that. And very importantly, we're able to say, hey, on this particular transaction, these 2 or 3 things were changed at the same time, because we understand the implication of, hey, somebody changed an order amount. So if they change an order amount, that's going to change the price and it's going to change the ship date. Well, you can see that as part of a single transaction by the way we store it, but in other systems, all of that has to be coded and managed in a very difficult process. So what we do is we provide, as I said, this shared digital ledger that takes information from any of the transactional systems in the enterprise and enables a collaboration between multiple users interacting with the data using this shared digital ledger. So if you think about this, if you interact with people inside the enterprise today, or more importantly, or perhaps a better use case is outside the enterprise today, is there's some information that you say, hey, here's the current state of the data, but there has to be an exchange of information that goes back and forth between multiple users in order to say, what is the next iteration of any one of these data elements? And inside the Boardwalk environment, this ledger is able to change and version over time. And as people collaborate, all the information is chained together. The individual elements that are shared back and forth are tracked. And then as you go through the process, the data that is agreed to as part of the data is committed to either the blockchain hash that's provided by Boardwalk, or it can be pushed out to other blockchain networks. And also, the agreed-to data can be pushed back into the ERP and the point solution. So it's really focused on, these environments are transactional, and this environment stores the result of transactions as data. But if you don't have a data environment in the middle that understands time and is able to do the versioning, then it really doesn't work. And what we do is we provide kind of the core platform that's at the heart of the enterprise application. And let me drop down a little bit further just so it becomes very clear, right? So I went in and I mentioned, hey, let's run a query against, Salesforce or SAP or anything and take out information against a purchase order. So this is a single line item that you want to manage as part of and maybe it's a letter of credit or something else. But all of this data needs to be managed on the ledger, and it needs to be accessible by different systems. So in other words, some of this data may be coming from your transactional system, some of it may be worked on by a partner, and some of it may be worked on by your internal people. And this is where we really distinguish ourselves in that if you have a track and trace blockchain application where only one person is touching the data and it's a very serial interaction, then existing technologies can certainly work fine for that because the data movement and the accessibility is not as complicated. But when you have an exchange that has a lot of touches, which is often the case in the enterprise, you need to be able to have multiple people interacting with this data at the same time. And very importantly, not all the data is final, right? So in other blockchain approaches, if you go in and you update something, that's considered a transaction as part of the blockchain. But in reality, there's information that needs to evolve, and you need to be able to understand the provenance and change of that data, in addition to having the information that you've agreed to that you want to commit as part of a blockchain hash. And this capability for integrating data into multiple systems and managing as part of our digital ledger is actually something that we were awarded a cool vendor from Gartner. So the customer traction plus the recognition from industry, I think, plus the patent, and it kind of gives you a good feel for the strength of the underlying technology. And if you look at the ledger itself, and you think about the checkbook, and of course none of us try to use checkbooks anymore, but in a checkbook you go in and you say, oh, I wrote this check and it's for X amount of dollars. Well, in our ledger, we're taking these grids of data, which is this application, and we understand the time-based change of everything without having to do any program. So this is showing you that here's the interaction for people interacting with the ledger. And as they make changes, it's looking at the data and saying, well, are they adding rows, are they updating cells, are they changing formulas, if they're working inside of an Excel environment, you can share formulas and everything. And then for each individual cell, it's built in the ability to understand how it changes over time. And again, I mentioned that earlier when I was talking about the purchase order, but if you want to say, hey, if this value gets to 140 and it's been approved by these 4 people, then go ahead and commit it to the blockchain. But if it's not at 140, it needs to be routed through workflow to 3 other people. You need to have a system that understands this data and also can relate it to other information as part of the blockchain application. So what does this look like? If you take a look at, the value of being able to take this historical data and the data that's changed over time, and you say, well, what does that mean from a business perspective? It means that you can look at the data that's happening. In this case, this is an example of, let's take a look at a particular SKU as part of an apparel application and say, what does the machine learning tell me about that? Well, it tells me that for this particular SKU, there's been 50 POs that are interacting against this, and then what's the activity level against this information, right? And this is the problem with the traditional data environments. And for example, a data warehouse is they'll go ahead and they'll make a copy of the current data and they push it out, once a week, and then they do an analysis against that. What's really important is what's happening during the course of the week. How many times did somebody touch the data? How many times did they go in and change the ship date or the quantity date? Not just the things that you're committing externally to an environment that you're going to do data analytics. So if you have a system that supports transaction chaining and versioning, then you're able to leverage this machine learning capability to say, not only what transactions have committed to the blockchain itself, so it's the irrefutable store of the resultant agreements, but also how's the underlying data changed over time, and is there a risk against, for example, these purchase orders not being fulfilled or production delivery being late because the individual steps associated with this interaction, in this case, this is a PO whip process that the client's doing, and they want to be able to understand, is there a risk about having this information or having this particular product laid. And this applies to anything. It applies to pharmaceutical, cosmetics, I mean, any product where people are touching this process information and you're trying to get an understanding of, do I have an issue with this and what's the impact going to be? And if I, pull back and say, well, how do you get to this point? We take a very different approach to the enterprise blockchain deployments. Is that in other systems, first of all, the storage mechanism is primarily what they call a key value pair database. So it's a text. You're taking a set of text and you're pushing it out to a blockchain ledger and storing that as a transaction. But that's fine if you're doing Bitcoin, but in the context of the enterprise, you need to understand how this data is related to each other. You need to have an understanding of, well, if I change this, what's the impact of this change against other data? And all of that has to be custom programmed with other systems, whereas in the Boardwalk system, since we naturally have the ability to manage grids of data over time, and we also have access control where you can go in and say, hey, I've got this blockchain ledger that I'm sharing, but I don't want each one of my trading partners to see each other's data. I want them only to be able to see the data they're supposed to see. And as the data moves over time, you're able to layer workflow on top of that to say, oh, if the data value is greater than 150, then this is agreed to, provided these other people have said this is okay. But if not, it needs to be routed to this person because they need to be able to do something. Or if it's a contract manufacturer and a supplier, you can have them looking at the same line that I was talking about before, and as they finish updating their data, they don't see any of the upstream data, but the upstream data people see the downstream, and as they make changes, it's self-reconciling. And all of that capability is out of the box. So really the customization comes in on the smart contract, which is the business logic specific to the interaction for the data, which is why we're able to do an equivalent deployment in only 6 weeks, as opposed to 6 months with other systems. So let's, kind of take a look at a specific use case. And in this one, I'm, saying, let's take a look at, the apparel market and say, how would this work for a particular apparel client? And if you look at use cases for apparel, and really this kind of applies to, a lot of different application areas in supply chain, but obviously there's supply planning, there's vendor onboarding, there's sourcing, there's work in process visibility, there's invoice reconciliation, promotion and pricing. I mean, if you think about all of these applications, these are things that are being used to drive your business today. And what happens is, and let's just use the example of invoice reconciliation, there's some amount of work that happens, let's say in promotions, or even in the context of creating work orders for people to build things. And the supply chain team goes ahead and does that and sets up the relationships with the vendors to say, here's what I want you to buy, or this is what I've agreed to buy, or this is what I'm willing to promote. But then that information is then dumped off to the finance team. And the finance team needs to go through a reconciliation process to say, well, wait a minute, these POs don't line up with what's actually invoiced. Or this agreed to plan doesn't match what was being billed. And so blockchain gives you the ability to take this collaborative exchange between trading partners and say, let's give people visibility to the information that they don't see today and bring it onto the blockchain ledger so it's self-reconciling. Another example is in pricing. So if you think about pricing and you say, hey, I've got a multi-layer supply chain and I've got a contract manufacturer and then some sub-tier manufacturers below that, and you're going out and you're either doing the pricing or you're doing planning, and right now you really don't have visibility below that first level, even though it is a trusted relationship and you have a contract with these people. And what happens is at the end of the month, you get a bill that says, oh, well, the price changed. And this is what it actually cost you, even though we originally said it was going to be this. Well, that kind of, deters everybody, because everybody then goes back and says, oh, well, I'm going to make the agreed to pricing be a little bit higher because I have to be able to cover this flux. And I'm also going to increase my inventories everywhere because I'm not sure exactly what's happening. And you don't want to be surprised and you don't want to have stockouts. So with the blockchain, you're able to, and specifically the digital ledger, you're able to really optimize, in this case, I'm talking about apparel, the assortment plans and the quantities. But this really applies to any supply chain area where you're saying, hey, I need to be able to plan on the demand side and line that with what I want to be building. And I specifically want to make sure that I'm optimizing my inventory and also, reducing the planning cycles as much as possible. And in the case of apparel, it's reducing the risk of the line drop, because you don't want to plan something and then have an issue where the POs aren't being fulfilled, or there's a quality issue or something with a supplier and you're not going to be able to carry a product. Now, since you have this chaining of data as it changes over time, machine learning gives you the ability to say, am I going to be at risk with revenue? Have I seen this interaction with this particular supplier trend towards an issue about getting something from a product perspective such that I'm not going to be able to count on this revenue happening, or having something related to inventory, or seeing that POs have been late in the past, so therefore I'm going to have a stock out for a particular product. And as we worked with this client, what they found is that, and we tried to service the top level ROI, is that with this alignment and visibility using the digital ledger, they were able to take their process iterations from 6 weeks to 1 to 2 weeks. So if you think about your business and you think about the interaction you're having with your external partners and saying, how long does it take for me to interact with my partners and get to the point where I have an agreement in my plan, it's taking a long time. And then on top of that, once you've agreed to something, you have to often go through a second reconciliation step in order to clean everything up and make sure everybody gets paid. Well, with a digital ledger, you're able to have the transaction chaining, you're able to have the alignment, and you're able to give visibility to everybody, which gives you the ability to do this reduction in process iteration. And then you're able also to have the blockchain as the irrefutable data store of the agreed to items associated with this collaboration, which minimizes the reconciliation and other things that happen to go alongside this process. So combining those two things together, not only from a productivity perspective, but the impact on the business can be considerable, because you can, in this case, do a reduction in inventory of 2 to 4%, overall. Plus, you're making sure that you're building, the right product at the right time and delivering it for the clients. So if we step back and we say, well, what does this mean for every company in general? And in this case, we've kind of generalized this because this is the work we've had with different companies. And we said, well, for a $300 million company with 40 people involved in a process where people are emailing and kind of manually managing data, that's eating up 10% of everyone's time right there, just manually sending that information back. So if you take that and you apply it to this group of people and you say, well, how much am I saving if I am able to return this time to everybody? That's $300,000. And then I talked about the process iterations, and this doesn't even really address to the fact that this is just productivity. This doesn't account for the fact that you can make better decisions. And instead of doing one decision a month, you're able to do 4 decisions a month if you bring it down to a weekly basis. So the return in terms of annual savings for leveraging the ledger and leveraging the capabilities of blockchain environment is upwards of close to $1 million for just 40 people working on a process. So as we look at what we call the transformation or the digital transformation for companies, we really tell people to think of it in kind of 3 steps. One is this notion of transaction chaining. So this is where you're able to connect and leverage people working together and getting aligned on information that's chaining over time. And this is really the important thing, right? Because if you don't understand how data has changed over time, then your blockchain application is not going to be very effective. And it's going to be very difficult to have alignment, because alignment is based on this person said this, and then now I need to react to that, and then they need to react to that, and then I need to react to it, right? So this is different than the track and trace. This is a back and forth where you're running your business, where I need to be aligned, and then I have to have kind of realignment on a continuous basis, right? So this is where instead of taking a month to do something, you're saying, what can I do in a week? And can I do it quickly so that I can get aligned in order to get better speed, lower costs, and be more responsive in terms of my interaction between all the people I work with? And then since the transaction chaining is capturing all of the data that's being exchanged, not just final transactions, this is where you're able to leverage the machine learning capability, because you're able to look across all the data and say, where have I seen a lot of changes with a particular supplier? Or where am I seeing issues with a particular SKU? Or where am I seeing issues with a particular factory? Or where am I seeing issues with a particular salesperson? I mean, think about the amount of time that it takes in order to discover this. And if you have this built into the process because you're looking at how data changes over time, then you're able to start leveraging this so that when you're in the alignment area, you're able to start seeing the inferences to say, hey, there's a high risk of something happening here based on the data that's happened in the previous area. And none of this insight is biased. And the reason I bring that up is that if you think about the way machine learning works today, for the most part, they have to take a snapshot of the data and then store that in a data warehouse or some other mechanism, because there's not a continuous versioning capability that's easily deployed. Certainly you can do it, but it's not a trivial thing. And in the case of the Boardwalk environment, it's built in as part of the box. So you're able to see, all of the data and how it can apply to your supply chain information. So we're coming up on the bottom of the half hour, so I just want to summarize with the things we talked about. We think that the real value for blockchain for the enterprise in the near term is focusing on efficiency and cost. Many of you have heard about consortiums and co-opetition, and we've had clients that have said, hey, we want to be able to work with our competitors in our marketplace in order to do better with recycling. We're like, well, great, let's, we're already working with one of your competitors. Let's get you two together and we talk about it. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, no, I don't want them to know how many, bottles or how many things that we're using on a monthly basis. So over time, that will be there. But today, if you look at the interactions that you're having with your trading partners, and you think about something like EDI, and you say, wow, EDI is not collaborative, and how much friction is built into these exchanges between the people that I work with, and then how much extra work is being done. So if you look at the, the separate reconcile and exception processes, I mean, it adds 30 to 40%, or you can recover 30 to 40% of the administrative work that happens separately on top of the lack of agreement that you have today if you're applying a blockchain technology, because it is self-reconciling and everybody's able to see the most recent information. And then as you extend out blockchain further, then you're able to take advantage of the smart contract execution where, for example, once there's an agreement, not only is it committed to the blockchain ledger, but then you also have an automated payment where it says, okay, go ahead and release this payment to the vendor because the agreement has happened. But from our perspective, if you don't have the digital ledger and you don't have the legacy connections or the data connections to your legacy systems, and set up an environment where everybody can work on the information at the same time, you're able to see how the data changes over time, get alignment between all the parties. If you don't have that, then you can't stand up a blockchain application very well. And what Boardwalk offers is a platform that's specifically designed to address this issue of how do I set up a data ledger environment that can be used to support any application, not just a custom one as you see with some of these POCs, but any application in the enterprise that requires an exchange of information between multiple parties and a way to store a resultant transaction information that's irrefutable and verifiable by everybody else so that you can speed up the reconciliation and get everybody aligned on what the next process step is for the business. So we'd love to talk to any and all of you about, because we're at the bottom of the half hour, so I'm going to have to answer the questions we got separately, and I'll send those emails out to people to answer those back. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. But you'll be hearing from us as we follow up. And equally, if you've got an idea for a blockchain POC or would like to understand a little bit more and see a demo, please email it at us at info@boardwalktech.com or just reply to the invitation you were sent. And we'd be glad to A, send you out the slide deck, or B, talk about your specific use cases, or talk about anything else associated with blockchain in the industry and how Boardwalk Tech can be applied with our digital ledger technology to your areas and the blockchain space. So thank you everybody for your time today, and have a great weekend.